Okay. I'll start this. Good afternoon to all of you. Hearty welcome to this session. The area that I will be discussing today is on industrial and employment relations, which is a component of your course module MMPH 004 block 1. The entire course in this particular block has been divided into 5 different units or 5 different chapters, which particularly deal with the various aspects of industrial relations and employment relations. First chapter or part unit deals with the concept and approach. Second deals with the evolution of industrial relations, particularly in the context of in India. Third, the contribution that has been made by the International Labour Organization to the legal framework that is prevalent in the present context in India. Fourth is with regard to labor administration, and fifth, the global trends relating to industrial relations. Now, of this, today I will be taking up the first unit, which is the concept and approach of industrial relations or industrial and employment relations. Now, first of all, let me clarify that industrial relations or employment relations, though technically the term differ, has its origin particularly during the post-industrial revolution period. That means after the so-called advent of the modern factory system, when there is a transformation regarding the way that work has been done, and secondly, the transformation of an agrarian society to that of an industrial society resulted into formation of a specific category of workers known as the industrial workers. Now, when the industrial workers as a particular group emerged, it obviously started with the migration of the people from the rural areas to the so-called upcoming industrial urban centers. And thereby what happened, that there was a great change in the relationship between employer and the employees. The first thing, let me also clarify here that whether you call it industrial relations or employment relations, it emanates or it starts from the employment. That means where an employer provides employment to some of the employees or workers, or you call them as labor or whatever term that you can make use of that. The genesis of relationship start particularly by providing employment by an employer under specific terms and conditions which are obviously acceptable to the concerned employee. But this relationship, if you take into account prior to the Industrial Revolution, was to some extent can be considered to be quite, informal, personal, localized, employer and employee personally known to each other. So there is some kind of very informal and personal relationship whereby the employer to a larger extent was taking care of the employees. But when this transformed into an industrial society where the labor force transformed from the agriculture to that of the industry by a process of migration from one particular area to the other, there was a great change particularly between the relationship between the employer and employee. So the relationship particularly became very formal, impersonalized, and there were obviously the role of intermediaries between the employer and employee maybe in the form of contractors or the third-party persons who were drafting employees to come to work in establishments. And in that kind of a situation, obviously when the entrepreneurship, which were moved by so-called profit, and by traditional, if you take into account from the point of economics, there are three different factors of production, like capital, land, and labor. And to a larger extent, the prices for the capital and land were fixed. Obviously, the labor was a particular factor which was to be manipulated or exploited, and that happened in the initial stage of industrial revolution, in whichever country it first started. Whatever happened, particularly in the initial stages, maybe sometime in the 18th century in the West, we can find a similar situation maybe in the mid-19th century when industrial revolution started in India. So the industrial employees, obviously who were employed, have undergone various kinds of changes over a period of time. And when they work together and they found that they are being to some extent exploited because of either longer hours of work or inadequate wages or poor wages or unhygienic working conditions and so on, they started realizing that maybe as in the context of an individual employee vis-a-vis an employer, maybe the employee can be considered to be relatively weak and can be considered to be vulnerable. But if they can unite themselves, form collective bodies of themselves, which subsequently were known as the trade unions, they can obviously exert some pressure on the employer to get their legal right. And as such, trade unions of workers emerged as a counterforce to the exploitation of the employer's exploitative practices, demanding adequate fair wages, standard hours of work, physical and hygienic working conditions, and so on. Now, this obviously resulted into some kind of a conflict between employer and the employees. One simple example, let me give you with regard to how a difference can exist between employer and the employee or between the employer and the worker. If you take into account wage or salary as a particular component, a relation that is a particular aspect that related to employment, wage or salary is obviously an income for the workers, where this can be an expenditure or cost for the employer. And by human nature, obviously, everyone tries to minimize the cost of the expenditure and maximize the income. So workers will be constantly demanding maybe a particular wage which may be look fair to them, but may be considered to be from the point of view of the employer too high to be paid. Or the reverse can also be true, where the management or the employer pays a wage which can be considered to be fair from the management point of view, but which look like relatively low from the worker's side. And obviously, what emerges a difference of opinion with regard to the same issue of wages. And that results into form of a conflict, or sometimes we call it a dispute. But obviously, whenever maybe there is possibility or acceptance of a dispute does not mean that dispute has to continue. It has to be prolonged on. There must be efforts made, particularly to resolve it, to solve it, in order to maintain a balance in the relations between employer and employee, because these are the two important components of an industry, and unless otherwise there is harmony or peace between these two, none of the industry or organization can virtually function or sustain for a longer period of time. Though mid-17th or 18th century, suppose we find the advent of the Industrial Revolution, in the present context, you can find a lot of changes have taken place. Change is obviously a constant process. We don't find the type of organization that were in existence in the mid 18th or 19th century in terms of the organization that you find in the present context, because the focus of the organizations, the industry has also undergone change. And we are also in the constant process of industrial revolution, and presently we call ourselves to be industrial revolution 4, stage 4. We started with the mechanization process as industrial revolution 1. We went further in the second stage with regard to automation. Then we went for the robotics with the application of computers, and further we are now in the stage of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So a lot of changes obviously have taken place, resulting into change not only in the structure and functioning of the organization, but also in terms of the requirement on the part of the employees or the structure of the labor force in any economy. Particularly if you look into the change that have taken place, once probably what dominated a particular period of time was with regard to cost of a particular product, how to minimize the cost of the product. Lesser the cost, the organization has a better advantage in the market for making the goods and services sellable. But subsequently from cost, along with the cost, the second factor came to being is with regard to quality of the particular product. So cost not only simply can be considered to be a sole criteria for a particular product or service, but quality has also been taken into account. Apart from the cost and quality, the third factor that came to being is with regard to flexibility, differentiation with regard to the particular product, keeping in view the cultural aspects of a particular nation. And fourth, what is needed is innovation, developing new kind of products. Present day, the different kind of gadgets that we find, starting from a very simple mobile phone or a pager earlier to that. Now, suppose if you take into account a smartphone in the hands of any particular person, even a child, can manipulate many of the complicated activities which probably once what was done by the NASA computers. So this kind of a change that has resulted in terms of change in the technology demanded also change in the quality of the manpower. Present day, you do find that workers as in the past were either unskilled or hardly semi-skilled, doing mostly manual work and so on. But present day context, mostly we find people who are you will find the people who are mostly technically qualified and highly skilled. There is also a transformation with regard to various aspects of the economy in terms of emerging new type of sectors, particularly if you take into account the IT sector, which has emerged as an important segment of providing employment. So all these have resulted into a change in the structure or the quality of the workforce. And the present day, normally we consider ourselves or organizations are particularly dealing with more educated or can be considered to be dealing with more knowledge workers. Unlike maybe suppose 20 or 30 or 50 years back, the type of workforce that they were there employed in the organization. So keeping in view this particular change that has taken place, and also with regard to the approach of the management or the employer towards the employees, it necessitates that what was considered to be at a particular point of time something to be unilaterally decided by the employer and considered to be followed by the workers or by the employees, no more can hold good, because the workers or employees are equally aware or are concerned about their needs, and they must be heard, particularly relating to their issues before a decision is being taken unilaterally by the employer or by the management. Because that takes into account of developing a healthy mutual, positive relationship between employer and the employee, or maybe so you consider it to be between management and the labor. Now, with this kind of a background that has taken place in general world over, this is not specifically to any suppose as one country. This is a worldwide phenomenon that is taking place. Let me come to the second aspect, which is more relevant to be discussed with regard to the concept of industrial relations or employment relations. Now, earlier the term that was in use was obviously industrial relations, but subsequently the development in literature and the further research in that area had led to the use of this particular term as employment relations or employee relationship, replacing industrial relations. Now, industrial relations, particularly if you take into account, it expresses a collective relationship that exists between the employer and the employees. What I mean collective relationship here is the employer and their organizations and employees and their organizations. As workers can form their organizations, as I told you earlier with regard to trade unions, employers very well can also form their own organizations, and they can also equally register themselves as trade unions under the Trade Unions Act. But so that is what expresses with regard to the industrial relations as a collective, at a collective level. But sometimes if you take into account, there is also a relationship that the basic structure of employment, that is the individual relations between employer and employee. And employment relationship or employee relationship particularly focuses upon this relation between an individual employee vis-a-vis, if you take into account, the employer. So here, obviously, it is some issues which can be considered to be collective in nature can be addressed through industrial relations. It may be wages, it can be, suppose, bonus, it can be working conditions, it can be relating to some of the benefits that can be provided. But apart from that, there can be considered to be something which is specifically more related to an individual, maybe at the psychological level, maybe at the emotional level, maybe at the social level. These are also to be addressed by the employer. If you take into account, for example, motivation, if you take into account job satisfaction, if you take into account the socialization of the individuals and so on, these are to be more or less addressed individually, because whereby all these aspects differ from one individual to that of the other individual. But normally, suppose if you take into account, it has to be at both the fronts. Not only that you focus upon the specific individual needs and address them, keeping in view the specific individual aspects, but at the same time you can look into the collective aspects in general, cutting across all the employees employed in the organization. But in spite of whether it is a collective or whether it is individual, industrial relations as a concept or as a particular approach has never remained static again. As in the context of organization, as I've told you, industrial relations has also undergone changes. There are many factors, obviously, that are responsible or can be contributory for this. Because industrial relations, if you take into account, which is confined maybe to a particular unit, means an organization, it can be at a particular industrial level or a regional level. It can also be at the macro level, at the national level. And all these obviously function with some kind of a social, economic, political setup. With changes that are taking place either in the economic or the political setup, obviously its effect can be visible to be found on industrial lessons. Sometimes, obviously, if you take into account, for example, if you take in India, the type of industrial lessons mostly that we discuss or prevalent maybe prior to the 1990s, obviously have undergone changes after 1990s by the introduction of the so-called new economic policy. By then, 30 years back, a lot of changes have taken place because of the impact of the economic policy upon the labor market and also with regard to the employer-employment relationships. So you have to look into the industrial lessons as a concept, or if you look into the industrial lessons as a particular, suppose a practice or a particular institution from the historical perspective, how it has begun, how it is functioning, what are the external factors that are probably has its impact upon it, what is the internal dynamics that works within an organization, or maybe at the intermediary level at the industry or at the regional level, politicization, the influence of politics, mostly with regard to the trade union activities or trade unionism and so on. So historical, cultural, social, economic, political factors obviously have its own role to impact or influence upon the industrial relations. That is why what we considered on one aspect, that industrial relations never remain static. It is a dynamic one. It goes on changing, keeping in view the changes that are taking place in the broader economic, social, political environment. Now, industrial relations not only remain suppose confined to a particular nation, it can also take into account to be prevalent in the international perspective. Because in the present day context, if you take into account labor as a particular factor, what is necessary to establish is uniform treatment to labor across the globe, across the world. There should not be any kind of a difference with regard to certain basic facilities or basic characteristics of labor, whether they are working in the most economically developed nation or maybe in one of the most economically backward nation. Workers, labor across the world should be treated in the same platform, should be treated similarly. The condition, the working condition should be similar. For example, if you take into account hours of work as a particular example, where normally we consider that 8 hours of work is the standard work that can be performed by an individual, whether it's working in India or America and some African countries. So in this particular context, labor has gone considered to be at the international level, and one particular organization which has significantly contributed for the cause of the labor and also with regard to developing healthy industrial relations practices is the International Labour Organization, known as the ILO, which was formed in 1919 with its headquarters now at Geneva, Switzerland. It is a tripartite body having representatives from the different countries known as the member states. The representation is tripartite in the nature, in the sense that it represents the employer, employee, and the government. Coming to the third aspect that we can take here is with regard to the objectives or what is the significance, what role that industrial relations particularly play whether it is at the macro level, at the national level, or at the micro level if you take into account the unit of the organization level. Now, at the macro level, obviously, the objectives may be a little bit more wider, more broader, addressing to the national objectives with regard to the economic development or a sustained economic development, productivity, and so on. But the same thing can also be true for the organizations at the organizational level or at the unit level equally. Maybe the parameters of considering them may be different from that of the macro level with that of the micro level. Now, when you talk about with regard to productivity or economic development, obviously industry particularly play a very major role in contributing to the economic development, and particularly the GDP, if you look into, is more depending upon the industrial product than that of the agricultural products. Whether it is large farms or small farms or middle farms or whatever it may be, the contribution towards the GDP is significantly high in comparison to the agriculture in the present context. So industry obviously play a very dominant role with regard to shaping up the economic stability and growth of a particular country. If though industries do not function properly and thereby contribute for the economic sustainability and development, a country's economic progress obviously would be curtailed and would be jeopardized. And as such, industries should function in such a manner that it should contribute to the economic development of the nation. And if you look into the economic, the proper functioning of the industries or the industrial establishment or the organization, what is pertinent that comes into focus is the type of relationship that exists between employer and employees in the specific establishment. More peaceful an atmosphere in organization in terms of there is industrial peace and harmony between the employer and the employees, or the employer and the trade unions, the labor in that organization, can be considered to be more congenial and can be contributory for a better performance of the organization in terms of its productivity, in terms of its quality, or in terms of its contribution to the economy. So primarily, obviously, if you take into account in the context of the success of a particular organization in terms of productivity and so on, much depends upon the type of relationship that exists. It does not mean, I don't mean here particularly the other factors are not responsible for it. Like suppose if you take into account the infrastructure, if you take into account the technology, if you take into account the quality of raw material, all these obviously have a role. But having all this in the absence of a harmonious relation between the labor and employer may just to be result into a contrary beyond the expectation on the part of the organization. So the aim is particularly to maintain a harmonious, constructive, positive relation between the employer and employees. It is particularly for the purpose of maintaining industrial discipline inside the organization. It is particularly for the purpose of providing an opportunity to the employees of the labor to become involved in the management of the organization, in the decision-making process, at least on the issues relating to them or concerned to them. It may be with regard to the distribution of the results that accrue from it, in terms of suppose the end of the profit sharing, or if you take into account the bonus and all these things, aspect can be taken into account by a mutual decision-making process. It can be also for developing a healthy social order within the organization and the establishment. So if you take into account an industrial relation at the core of an organization with regard to the relationship that is being maintained between employer and employee. It can have its influence and impact on many of the factors in the organization, which can contribute positively if the relationship is good and positive. So that is the importance and significance of the industrialization in any organization from the perspective of the role that it plays for the productivity, for the profit, or for the quality of the product, and so on. So that is why the necessity of that again is for the purpose of uninterrupted suppose supply of goods and commodities and services to the public. The citizens of a particular country depend upon the product and services issued provided by different organizations. It can be a service, it can be a product. If there is any disruption in the particular service, maybe it may be because of the relation between employer and employee. It does not remain confined to the employer and employee. Its implication can be found upon other stakeholders in the society. For example, if there is a strike in the electricity in the electricity department or in the transport department, it may be considered that it is between the employer and employee of the same establishment. But the public who depend upon consumption of power or for transportation, they are going to be affected. They are the stakeholders. And organizations particularly are there to produce different kind of goods and services ultimately to meet the needs of the people. So relations may, from the narrower point of view, can be confined only to that of the employer and employee inside an organization, but its impact, whether positive or negative, can be visible upon different other stakeholders, not only with regard to the general public in the form of the customers. It can be also in terms of the shareholders of the company and so on. It can be upon the suppliers. It can be many other persons who are directly or indirectly linked to the activities of the organization. So the better any organization obviously would try to maintain a better relation between the employer and the employees. And in that particular context, a positive relation between them obviously have some kind of an advantage, not only for the organization itself, but in general to the public, to the nation, in terms of continuous service or goods, supply of goods, or contributing to the developing a healthy economy. Coming to the next aspect of industrialization, what you can take up is with regard to there are different kind of approaches that have been forwarded by various scholars or the writings of various persons in the form of the theory and so on. And particularly if you look into the course content that has been given to you, there are 8 different kind of approaches. Now, these 8 approaches are with regard to what is ultimately the way that industrialization particularly functions or can be looked into by its functioning inside the organization or at the macro level or maybe even at the macro level. The 8 approaches are the systems approach, the unitary approach, pluralistic approach, Marxist approach, the social action approach, the human relations approach, Mahatma Gandhi's trusteeship approach, and the socialistic approach. Of this, if you take on the first one, that deals with regard to the Dunlop's systems approach. It is John T. Dunlop who has developed this particular model and popularly known as the system approach, which is considered to be also an important contributory to the development of theory of industrial relations. Now, what he particularly emphasizes with regard to explaining industrial relations is that industrial relation can be taken into account in the form of a system. Now, what you mean here, system is always system has different kind of subsystems or subcomponents. And in order to make a system to work, the subsystems obviously have to work in a synchronized manner, in a very coordinated manner. Unless otherwise the different kind of subsystems work properly, the whole of the system cannot work. So taking into that particular approach, Dunlop has identified that industrialization system has three different subsystems or three different components, or sometimes it is called, there are three different actors. And the actors are identified as the employees and their organizations, the employers and their organizations, and the third, the most important factor that cannot be totally ignored, that is the state or the government. So normally when you take into account industrial relations, we consider that it is between employer and employee, where from the government comes into the picture. The government, when there is a conflict or a dispute between employer and employee, can the government remain aloof and simply remain as a fence sitter and watch what is happening, or it will interfere or intervene by any of the means in order to find a solution to the dispute or conflict that is in existence between employer and employee? So the government obviously has a particular role to play, and the interrelatedness between the three, that means the employer, their organizations, employees, their organization, and the state, their interactions, their interrelatedness, or the way that they interact between them depends upon a particular set of rules which can govern them or which can regulate them, so that the relationship between these three are properly regulated, are properly maintained. So one of the aspects of the system approach developed by Dunlop is rule making, that you prescribe different kind of rules, procedure, where you provide details about how that relationship can exist between employer and employees, how that they can behave and how they can interact between themselves, and what should be the role of the government in between the employer and employees. Government plays different kind of role in industrialization scenario. As we say that government consists of three, and as per our constitution, that we have three different kind of role that the government play: as a legislator, as an administrator, as a judiciary. Industrialization can also be taken into account in that particular context. Government can make different kind of legislations that can regulate the relation between employer and employees. Making legislation is not sufficient, or simply the purpose. Law has to be administered. The government role comes here as an administrator. How to implement or enforce the provisions of the law that has been passed relating to labor, or regulating the labor relation, regulating relation between employer and employees at the national or at the organizational level. In spite of that law, still suppose there is some kind of a conflict or dispute that goes on and that is not resolved by the employer or by the employee, there is obviously a necessity of the judiciary to resolve them. So the role of the government comes here very pertinent in the sense of regulating the relations in order to develop a healthy industrial relation climate, not only at the macro level, at the national level, but even at the micro level, at the unit level. So these are the three different actors as has been identified in terms of different type of role that they play. And in order to resolve their conflict, if at all at any point of time that it emerges, how to dissolve them by the interrelatedness or interaction between employer and their organization vis-a-vis employees and their organization. The second approach we talks about with regard to the unitary approach. Here, the approach is because the employer or the entrepreneur who has established the unit, any decision that is to be taken by the employer is sacrosanct and legally right. People say it is equivalent to a particular term, it is my boat, and the way that I want to handle the boat that is left to me, you are simply to be there inside the boat and you have to act accordingly as per my direction. So unitary approach says that employer has the sacrosanct right to take decision, and there is no opportunity on the part of the employees working in the establishment to raise their voice, because there must be unity with regard to the functioning of both the employer and employees in the same establishment. And employer has the right to take all the decision, mostly in terms of a paternalistic approach, wherein a family father takes all the decision for the well-being of the members of the family. So also, you can consider the employer takes a paternalistic role that of a father in the organization and decides everything without any opportunity for the employees to raise their voice or to say anything, but simply to follow the decision or instruction given by the employer. So there is obviously, it says, basing upon a particular idea, absence of any kind of conflict between the employer or difference of opinion between employer and the employees. On the contrary, if you take into account a pluralistic approach, it very much recognizes that there should be a pluralistic approach in the sense one must allow difference of opinion. One must allow to form an entity of the workers. Just like in the government, we find someone in power and someone in opposition. There must be some opposition or difference from the workers' side. The workers can be allowed to form the trade unions as a pluralistic body in the organization. And the management of employers who recognize them should allow them to function in the organization. Any decision that will be taken here, obviously, would be based upon maybe collective bargaining by the discussion between the employer and the employees or their organizations. So it allows the coexistence of workers as a separate entity, as a separate group. And in order to make the organization function properly in terms of maintaining relationship, management should establish a positive approach and attitude towards the trade unions. It should not consider to be something negative as working against the organization, but it should be considered to be the workers' voice, the workers' collective body, which is particularly for the protection of the interests of the workers. And if there is a difference, that can be sorted out by mutual discussion between them. On the other hand, Marxist approach, which is considered to be the emergence of Karl Marx's idea of communism, where it is an extreme in what he says, that there are two classes in the society. One is the capitalist and the other is the working class. And the working class are continuously, constantly exploited by the capitalists. And this is being supported to a larger extent even by the state. That is why what is necessary that get rid of the capitalist and let the working class or the proletariat, and the term that we use, ultimately take over the reins of the industry or the organization. So ultimately there will be a transfer of power with regard to the management of the industrial establishment or industry from that of the capitalist to that of the labor class, where the labor themselves will be the owners, and labor themselves will be employees, and labor themselves with the person taking decisions. So here it is just to some extent you can consider to be a unitary approach, but in different context. Unitary approach, management has the sacrosanct right to take a decision. Here the workers have the sacrosanct right to own the means of the production and ultimately take a decision for themselves. because as long as there is capitalist, the working class would be ultimately exploited. And when there is exploitation, obviously it cannot be considered to be a healthy industrial relations. Healthy industrialization can only be possible when the workers themselves are able to manage the industries by themselves as their own entities. Whereas on the other hand, if you take into account the social action, which action approach, it says that if you take industrial relations, it is not in that is nothing functions in isolation. You cannot take it exclusively a domain of relation between employer and the employees. Industries are part and parcel of a broader society, a broader environment. They function within a social, political, economic setup. They take resources from the environment. They supply goods and material services to the society. So there is always some degree of interdependence between the so-called external environment and the internal environment of an establishment. So there is a greater degree of influence or impact of the external environment upon the internal environment of the organization. So what takes place outside the organization can have a greater impact upon the organization. And as such, one cannot simply take industrialization as an isolated activity, deviated from the broader social activity. Any changes that take place in the external environment can also have its impact upon the internal environment of an organization. So there is a nexus what you find, a relations between the external environment and internal environment. And to a larger extent, the internal environment with regard to industrial relations, whether it is at the micro level or at the national level, is greatly influenced by the various national level, broad economic, political, social, cultural factors. The human relations approach, on the other hand, establishes a different type of approach, taking into account employees primarily as human beings, and they are to be treated like human beings. Because sometime in the initial stages of industrial revolution, when profit motive was probably the ultimate motto or ultimate aim on the part of the entrepreneurs, and workers were exploited, they were subjected to obviously different kind of treatments which cannot be considered to be human in nature. But of all the different type of factors of production that are being taken, whether it is machine, equipment, technology, raw material, anything that you take, human resources are also a particular factor, and that is the only living factor. Others are non-living. So one must have some kind of a human approach in treating the labor as human beings, as a fellow with a fellow feeling, with some kind of a humanitarian consideration, with sympathy, taking into account their needs and necessity, and more specifically when they are in any kind of exigency. There are a lot of literature that have also come in this particular context. Various authors like William Foote White, or if you take into account Elton Mayo, who is considered to be the father of the human relations school, emphasizes this, that organizations which consist of the people not only have different kind of impersonal system, but there are also different kind of informal systems working in the organization. So the approach on the part of the employer or the management to the workers should be with a fellow feeling of human beings and recognize with regard to the social implications of this kind of relationship inside the organization. Recognize the informal association or organization that exists within the formal setup. That obviously will be the spontaneous outcome within the formal setup. So primary focus upon here is treating the working or the workers or the employees as human beings and looking into their necessity and taking into, or maybe you can consider them, look to the various kinds of need and necessity from their point of view and accordingly take decision, thereby giving due importance to the feeling or empathy for the workers. Next is with regard to Mahatma Gandhi's trusteeship approach, particularly known in India, where his emphasis as a message to the employer that none of the employers obviously have particularly contributed for creating any machine or any raw material or any, they are only simply intermediaries who can be considered themselves as the trustees, not in terms of legal, but maybe in terms of more of moral or ethical trustees. They are not the owner of the property that they feel they're owning, they're the trustees. The society has enshrined on them responsibility to act as a trustee. Now, what we mean here by trustee is particularly a person who takes care of the other individuals who are unable to take care of themselves. Particularly, we are acquainted with a trustee when you take into account a minor. Because the minor has certain kind of limitation, either inexperience or immaturity or lack of knowledge, awareness, and so on. He or she cannot be allowed to take a decision on his or her own, and he has to be dependent upon some other person for whom decisions are to be taken or to be managed, and that is known as a trustee. So the employer here is particularly trustee of the different kind of property, and they must treat the employees as the people that they have to take care of. But limitation is here in that if you take into account a trustee for a minor, when a person becomes a major, there is no role for the trustee to play. But obviously here, the workers or employees are considered to be eternal minors, immature person, and employer are considered to be the eternal trustees. But the idea, in order to have some kind of a different kind of approach of understanding the human beings as the labor and establishing a harmonious relationship is in the context of not as an employer, but as an employee, or as a trustee. Last is with regard to the socialistic approach, which is to some extent a little bit liberal that of the communism, where it takes into account the coexistence of the two parties, that the labor and the management of the employer and employee. It can be mutual recognition of the coexistence by a mutual decision-making process involving both the labor and management for taking decisions for the organization. So to some extent, when you look into all these kind of approaches, it primarily is based, it focuses upon that what kind of relationship that should exist and what kind of approach that should be there with regard to maintaining that relationship, and more specifically when there is a dispute between the employer and employee, or there is a disruption of any kind of relation between employer and employee in any industry or in organization at the micro level or maybe at the macro level. Now, last factor, obviously the factors which affect the industrial relation scenario. It can be examined from two different perspectives. One is certain factors which are obviously internal to an organization, which mostly you can take into account, which occurs at the micro level or at the industrial level. And the second factor, which are obviously external to the organization. Internal factors are obviously which takes place inside the organization. This may be various features confined to a particular organization. It may be management-related issues. It can be worker-related issues. Management-related issues may be in the context of the change in the style of the management. The work-related issue can be related to change in the structure of the workforce, change in the technology. So different aspects relate to here so far the internal dynamics of the organization. Whereas external, obviously, it takes into account with regard to the broader social, political, economic factors. Sometimes, suppose if you take into account economic meltdown and its effect, sometimes if you take into account recent effects, suppose if you take into account the pandemic with regard to COVID-19 and its impact on the last 2.5 years. So natural calamities and so on obviously have some kind of impact upon the organization, which also suppose influences the type of industrialization that exists in the organization. So in total, when you take into account industrialization is a dynamic concept, it is being influenced by various broader social, economic, political factors. These are being influenced by different kind of internal dynamics concerning in the organization. And basically, what it emphasizes is that it has a greater role to play, not only for the smooth functioning of an organization, but also contributing for the economic development or with regard to the sustainable economic development of the nation as a whole. Thank you very much. We will continue our discussion in the next area tomorrow.